The morning light cast long shadows over the buildings of the industrial district. Within these hulking structures, a symphony of mechanical noise played out day after day, the grinding of gears and the whirring of machinery creating a cacophony that had become as familiar as birdsong to its inhabitants. The largest building, a glass factory, hummed with activity. Within this hive of industry, a man named Ron was beginning his workday. Ron was a man of age 52, with hair a dull gray and a face lined by the ravages of time. His figure, slightly hunched, was a testament to his years spent laboring in the factory. "Hey, Ron," a voice called out over the noise. It was Mark, a forklift operator with a loud voice and an easy smile. Same old, huh?" Ron gave a small chuckle, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he did so. "You know it, Mark." "Same old." Mark nodded, a knowing smile on his face. The rest of their exchange was swallowed by the noise of the factory. This was their ritual, a small exchange that marked the beginning of their shared workday. Ron's job at the factory was one that demanded precision and dedication. He was responsible for checking the quality of glass products that came off the production line, a task he had done so for nearly 30 years. Each piece of glass, every item, had to be examined under the scrutiny of his trained gaze. Any blemish, any imperfection, and the piece was cast aside, deemed unfit for sale. For Ron, the routine was comforting. There was something reassuring about the pattern of his days, the rhythm of the factory and the familiarity of his coworkers. But lately, the monotony of his life began to weigh on him. The same faces, the same jokes, the same lunchbox. It was all becoming a little too predictable, a little too boring. In the past, he had been a Marine, a man of action. His tales from overseas missions were well known among his friends. But now, those days seemed distant, as if they belonged to another man, a different Ron. His once vibrant hair had turned gray. His body was no longer as sturdy, and his once sharp gaze seemed dulled by the endless inspection of glass. A sudden idea took root in his mind as he inspected yet another piece of glass. A change, something to break the monotony, something to breathe life back into his mundane existence. As the idea unfolded, he found himself smiling, a spark of excitement igniting within him. It was time for a change. It was time for Ron's new look. A sense of determination guided Ron's steps as he stepped off the factory floor that afternoon. He headed straight to a nearby barbershop, a small establishment tucked away on a bustling street. The signboard creaked gently in the breeze as he pushed the door open, the familiar tinkle of the entrance bell announcing his arrival. "Ron, is that you?" The barber, a stout, jovial man named Tony, greeted him with a broad smile. "I haven't seen you in ages. What can I do for you today?" "Hey, Tony," Ron greeted back, settling into the worn-out but comfortable barber's chair. "I need a change, a haircut, something that'll, I don't know, make me look younger." Tony studied Ron's reflection in the mirror for a moment, a thoughtful look on his face. "I think I've got just the thing," he finally said, reaching for a pair of shiny scissors and a comb. Ron watched as his gray hair fell in tufts onto the tiled floor. The buzz of the electric razor hummed in his ears as Tony worked his magic. The transformation wasn't immediate, but with each snip and trim, Ron could see a younger version of himself starting to appear in the mirror. When the cutting was done, Tony turned to Ron with a bottle of hair dye in his hands. "Ever considered going dark, Ron?" he asked, a twinkle in his eyes. "Trust me, it'll take off years." "Let's do it, Tony," Ron agreed, excitement coursing through his veins. As the dark dye set in, Ron began to see a dramatic change. The gray was replaced by a deep chestnut brown, and the new haircut gave him a fresh, youthful appearance. By the time Tony was done, Ron looked at least a decade younger. "Wow, Tony," Ron admired himself in the mirror, unable to hide his grin. "That's the spirit, Ron." Tony clapped his shoulder, clearly pleased with his work. A new look for a new beginning, eh? Feeling revitalized, Ron thanked Tony and exited the barbershop. There was a new spring in his step, a newfound confidence that made him stand a little taller. Ron was ready to show off his new look, ready for the world to see him anew. Little did he know then, the chain of events his transformation was about to set off. Upon returning home, Ron walked straight up to the old family computer perched on a small desk in the corner of his living room. The hum of the computer booting up was a familiar sound. But what he was about to do was entirely new territory. With a few clicks, he found himself on the homepage of Facebook. He had heard about the site from his coworkers and had seen it on his wife's laptop screen a few times. But he had never considered joining until now. "Time to show off this new look," Ron murmured to himself, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. The decision to create a Facebook account wasn't just about the change in his physical appearance. It was about reclaiming a piece of his past, a part of his identity that he felt he had lost over the years. As he started filling out the information for his profile, he paused when he came to the username section. After a moment of thought, he typed in Marina Shooterone, 111. It was a nod to his past, his time as a Marine, a shooter. The number 111 was his old Marine unit number. It was a username that brought a smile to his face. Next was the profile picture. He navigated his way to a folder hidden deep in the computer archives, filled with photos from his Marine days. After a moment of scrolling, his eyes landed on a picture of himself in full uniform, his younger face beaming with pride and confidence. It was a perfect match for his new username. "Perfect," he muttered, clicking on the photo to upload it. The process was easier than he thought. With a few more clicks, his Facebook profile was complete. Looking at the profile photo, he felt a pang of nostalgia for the young soldier he once was. But there was also a thrill, an excitement about this new venture. As his new profile picture, an old photo of himself in uniform, loaded onto the screen, he felt a strange sense of accomplishment. His old self, infused with his new look, was now out there for the world to see. As he sat back, admiring his handiwork, Facebook's algorithms started working their magic, suggesting friends for Ron to add. Among the suggestions, a young, beautiful woman in her mid-20s caught his eye. A new adventure was about to begin for Ron, one that would forever change his life. Once Ron's Facebook profile was set, he started adding friends. People he knew from the factory, old friends from his Marine days, even some distant relatives, all found a place in his growing digital social circle. Each new connection brought a sense of satisfaction. He was no longer the old Ron stuck in his monotonous life. He was now Marine Shooterone, 111, reconnected with the world. Amidst the familiar names and faces, Facebook's algorithms suggested a profile that stood out. A woman named Lisa, young and radiant. Her smile captivating. She was in her mid-20s, the same age as Ron was in his profile picture. He hesitated for a moment, his cursor hovering over the Add Friend button. "What's the harm?" he murmured to himself, clicking the button. The friend request was sent. His heart fluttered slightly, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. To his surprise, she accepted his request within minutes. A notification popping up on his screen. Ron felt a thrill running through him. His curiosity piqued. He clicked on her profile. There wasn't much available to view. Privacy settings keeping most of her life hidden from non-mutual friends. But he found himself entranced by her profile picture, her bright smile. On a whim, he decided to send her a message. "Hello, Lisa. It's nice to meet you. I'm Ron." The message felt neutral enough, friendly but not overstepping any boundaries. He hit send, feeling a strange mix of excitement and apprehension. Seconds turned into minutes, but soon enough, a reply notification popped up. "Nice to meet you too, Ron." Lisa's reply was casual, welcoming. A simple conversation started, discussing generic topics like the weather, hobbies, and eventually leading to deeper subjects. Lisa was studying for her master's degree in literature, and Ron found himself captivated by her eloquent and passionate views about her studies. Night fell outside as Ron sat in the glow of his computer screen, lost in this unexpected connection. He didn't notice the hours passing by as he chatted with Lisa, each message from her igniting a new wave of excitement in him. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time, a thrill he didn't know he was missing. This new connection, this young, beautiful woman on the other end of the chat, gave Ron a sense of anticipation, a fresh change from his mundane life. He found himself eagerly waiting for each of her responses, his heart pounding each time a new message notification appeared. Thus, the unexpected connection began, a spark that would soon turn into a flame, entangling Ron into a web of events he never could have anticipated. As Ron continued to chat with Lisa, a newfound energy coursed through his veins. It was as if this online interaction had reignited a spark within him that had long been dormant. Every ping of a new message made his heart leap. He found himself laughing at her witty remarks, his eyes growing wide with interest as she shared tales of her studies and dreams. Eventually, the conversation began to wind down. Lisa had an early class the next day, and Ron had to prepare for another shift at the factory. "All right, Lisa, it was nice talking to you," he typed, a hint of reluctance in his fingertips. "You too, Ron. Good night," she replied, her response lighting up the screen before it went silent. Ron leaned back in his chair, his heart still racing from the exhilarating exchange. His eyes flicked to his reflection on the darkened computer screen. For the first time in a long while, he liked what he saw, a younger, more vibrant version of himself staring back. As he shut down the computer and headed to bed, his mind was alive with thoughts of the evening's events. His life at the glass factory seemed a million miles away. He realized that he was smiling, a genuine smile that sprung from a feeling of youthfulness and excitement. Before drifting off to sleep, Ron took one last look at his reflection in the mirror, his newly dyed hair and fresh haircut accentuating his youthful features. He saw not the aging factory worker, but the man who had spent the entire evening captivating a young woman with his words. It was a transformation not just on the outside, but on the inside as well. Marin Chudaron 111, as Ron had come to think of himself, was no longer just a character on a social media platform. He had become a symbol of Ron's rejuvenation, a beacon of his newfound excitement for life. As he closed his eyes and surrendered to sleep, he couldn't help but anticipate the thrill that the next day would bring. This was just the beginning for Ron, a portal into a digital world that promised the exhilaration of new connections and a sense of relevance in the evolving era. And as sleep finally claimed him, Ron knew that his life would never be the same again. At the glass factory, where scorching heat mingled with the sound of grinding machines, Troy was a sight to behold. Standing tall and sturdy, his ebony skin glimmered with sweat, muscles straining against his uniform as he deftly maneuvered through his duties. His age was hard to guess, his face youthful, yet his eyes held a depth of wisdom that suggested years beyond his mid-20s. His dreads, tied back neatly, and his broad, warm smile made him popular among the factory workers. He carried an air of charisma that made people naturally gravitate towards him. Troy worked at the station next to Ron, and over the years, the two had formed a friendship based on shared hours and the solidarity of labor. Despite the significant age difference, they found common ground in the monotony of their work and the love for the NF. "Hey, old man," Troy would often call out to Ron, his voice booming over the cacophony of machinery. It was a term of endearment laced with teasing respect for Ron's seniority. "Still got more energy than you, kiddo," Ron would retort, winking at Troy, before the two would burst into laughter, their camaraderie a constant in the rhythm of the factory. Yet, beneath their jovial interactions, there was a palpable difference in their outlooks. Ron often caught Troy looking beyond the factory walls, a longing look that suggested dreams bigger than the small town they were in. In contrast, Ron had accepted the factory as a fixture of his life, his dreams replaced with a sense of resigned complacency. Their friendship was an unspoken agreement of understanding, a mutual respect for each other's space and ambitions. They were as different as two people could be, yet in the shared moments at the factory, they were just Ron and Troy, two men standing side by side, their lives intersecting amidst molten glass and grinding machines. Little did they know, this camaraderie would soon be tested by the unfolding events in their lives. On one ordinary Tuesday, Ron decided to share his newfound excitement with Troy. As they took a break together, Ron, with a secretive grin on his face, beckoned Troy to sit beside him. "Guess what, kiddo?" Ron said, his eyes twinkling with suppressed excitement. "What's up, old man?" Troy replied, leaning back on the factory wall, a bottle of water in his hand. "I met someone," Ron announced, unable to keep the satisfaction from his voice. Troy's eyebrows rose, and he nearly choked on his water. "What? You mean like a lady?" "Yeah," Ron chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck in mild embarrassment. "Met her online." Troy was silent for a moment, his eyes wide with surprise. "But," Ron shrugged, dismissing Troy's concern with a wave of his hand. "It's not like that. It's just chatting." Troy frowned, taking in Ron's nonchalant attitude. The Ron he knew was a decent, hard-working man, not the kind to venture into such territories. "Ron," Troy started, his voice filled with uncertainty. Again, Ron shrugged, a sheepish grin on his face. "Well, not exactly." The revelation hit Troy hard. It was one thing to hear about Ron's new friend, but entirely another to realize he was keeping it a secret from his wife. This was not the Ron he knew, and Troy felt an unsettling concern creeping into his heart. Troy shifted uncomfortably, his hands clenching and unclenching around the water bottle. He knew he had to tread lightly, but the gravity of the situation was too serious to ignore. "Ron, you're playing with fire here," he began, his voice heavy with concern. "What do you mean?" Ron asked, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Online chatting with some woman while you're married. That's not right," Troy explained, struggling to keep his voice steady. "I told you. It's harmless." "Just a bit of fun," Ron defended himself, a hint of annoyance creeping into his voice. "But Ron," Troy continued, undeterred by his friend's resistance, "do you remember the Bible verse, 'Whoever commits adultery lacks understanding. He who does it destroys his own soul.'" "I ain't cheating, Troy," Ron retorted, his voice echoing off the factory walls. "You don't have to be in bed with her to be unfaithful, Ron," Troy argued, his tone softer now. "This could lead to something you might regret." Troy's words hung in the air between them, a harsh truth slicing through the camaraderie they once shared. Ron's eyes flickered with an unreadable emotion, but he said nothing more. For Troy, this was more than just a friend making a bad decision. It was a breach of a moral code he held dearly, one that valued loyalty and honesty above all. And as he watched Ron wrestle with his words, Troy felt a pang of disappointment and growing concern for his friend's marriage. Despite his warnings, he couldn't shake off the sinking feeling that Ron was venturing down a path he might not be able to return from. Ron's face turned a shade darker under the factory lights. The implication of Troy's words stung, causing a frown to settle on his features. Troy was right in his way, but Ron was not ready to accept it. "Troy, you're overthinking this," Ron finally said, trying to maintain an even voice. "It's not as deep as you're making it out to be." Troy opened his mouth to argue, but Ron held up a hand, silencing him. "It's my life, Troy, and I appreciate your concern, but I can handle this." The words came out more abruptly than Ron intended. a defensive edge slicing through their camaraderie. Troy, surprised by the sudden harshness, fell silent. He gave Ron a long, worried look before nodding in resignation. "All right, Ron, but remember I warned you." The rest of the day passed in uncomfortable silence, their usual banter replaced with an underlying tension that seemed to echo within the factory walls. And despite Troy's warnings still ringing in his ears, Ron found himself drawn back into the virtual world later that evening. Sitting at his kitchen table, Ron logged into his account. As the messages from the young woman popped up on his screen, he felt a thrill course through his veins. This was his escape, his way of feeling young and free again. Troy's warnings felt like distant echoes, easily drowned out by the exhilaration of the online chat. Every message, every word exchanged, seemed to validate Ron's choice, convincing him that it was nothing more than harmless fun. It was a path he was choosing willingly, ignoring the potential danger lurking in the shadows. And so Ron continued to live his double life, seemingly undeterred by the risk it posed to his reality, the warnings of a friend dismissed as he ventured deeper into the online world. The following days at the factory were marked by an unusual silence between Ron and Troy. Their easy camaraderie had been replaced by a palpable tension. While they still worked together, their conversations were limited to the bare minimum, focused only on work. On one of these silent afternoons, Troy watched as Ron scrolled through his phone during their break. His heart clenched as he remembered their conversation about the young woman. He knew it was not his place to interfere in Ron's personal life, but he couldn't shake off the nagging concern. "Ron," Troy said softly, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Ron looked up from his phone, meeting Troy's gaze. "Yeah? We're friends, right?" "Of course we are," Ron replied, confusion crossing his face. "Then, as a friend, I'm telling you again, be careful. This, whatever it is, it's not worth ruining your marriage or our friendship," Troy said earnestly, hoping his words would get through to Ron this time. Ron's face hardened for a moment, but he didn't retort as he had done before. He simply nodded, his eyes returning to his phone, leaving Troy to wonder whether his warning had made any impact at all. The workday ended with both men lost in their own thoughts. As they clocked out, Troy couldn't help but glance at Ron, his friend yet a stranger, standing at a crossroads. It was a tense, strained silence that followed them out of the factory, the echo of their fractured friendship reverberating in their hearts. It was a silence that spoke of concerns unheeded, of warnings dismissed, and a friendship that stood on a precipice, threatened by secrets and untold truths. Troy tossed and turned in his bed, the ceiling fan above him doing little to cool the guilt that burned within. Ron's dismissive attitude had taken its toll on him. Unable to sleep, he rolled over and picked up his phone from the nightstand. The bright screen illuminated his conflicted expression. He navigated to Facebook, his mind filled with thoughts of Ron and the young woman. After a few moments of hesitation, he typed her username into the search bar. The profile picture that popped up confirmed that it was her. She was young and beautiful, just as Ron had described, but looking at her picture gave Troy a pang of unease. "She has no idea," he murmured to himself, thinking of Ron's wife, a woman who deserved better than what she was getting. He took a deep breath and hit the Add Friend button. "Troy, what are you doing?" he asked himself, his voice barely a whisper. He knew he was crossing a line, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to protect not just Ron, but this unsuspecting woman from the approaching storm. He left a simple message along with the friend request. "Hi, I'm Troy, a friend of Marine Shooterone, 111. I hope you don't mind me reaching out." As he set down his phone, Troy hoped he had done the right thing. He was tiptoeing around the edges of a secret, stepping into a world of lies and hidden truths. He wondered if he was ready to face whatever he would uncover, but the thought of standing by and doing nothing seemed far worse. His decision made, He turned off his phone, finally succumbing to sleep with the hope of navigating this tangled web come morning. In the quiet calm of their shared home, Brenda, Ron's wife, busied herself with her usual evening routine. As the aroma of a simmering pot of stew filled the kitchen, she hummed a cheerful tune, unaware of the storm brewing. On the kitchen table, Ron's phone buzzed, lighting up with a new message notification. Brenda glanced at it curiously. Ron never left his phone unattended. She hesitated for a moment, then picked it up. Her eyebrows furrowed as she read the sender's name on the screen, a name she didn't recognize. With a deep breath, she unlocked the phone, her heart pounding in her chest. There it was, clear as day. A barrage of messages from a young woman, the playful emojis and flirty messages stinging Brenda's eyes like hot tears. Her world came crashing down around her. She felt her heart sink, the pain so sharp it was as if she'd been physically struck. She quickly rifled through Ron's Facebook profile, discovering the old military photo and the fictitious identity he'd created. Brenda stared at the screen, her mind swirling with a storm of emotions. Betrayal, hurt, anger, and disappointment all surged within her like a torrential flood. But amidst it all, a single thought kept echoing. She had to set things right. Gathering her wits, she pulled up her own Facebook profile and clicked on the new message button. Her fingers hovered over the keys before she typed out the young woman's username. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing the weight of what she was about to do. She started the message with a brief introduction. "Hello, my name is Brenda. I am Ron's wife." Her eyes welled up with tears as she typed out the words. Yet she continued, driven by a desperate need for truth. "I think it's only fair you know who you've really been talking to," she wrote, attaching the unflattering photo of Ron taken just last week on his birthday. His skin marked by wrinkles, his hair noticeably grayer and his belly protruding slightly over his belt. Her finger hovered over the send button, her mind teetering on the precipice of uncertainty. With a deep breath, she pressed down, her heart echoing the finality of the click. She knew there would be consequences, that their lives would never be the same, but for the sake of honesty, it was a step she was willing to take. As she put down the phone, Brenda felt a strange mix of relief and trepidation. The truth was out now, unspooling into the digital world like a sail catching the wind. All that was left was to weather the storm that was sure to follow. Back at his home, Ron was still oblivious to the silent, digital storm that had swept through his life. He sat in his living room, scrolling through his Facebook feed, blissfully unaware of the truths that had been laid bare. "Ron," Brenda called from the kitchen, her voice slightly shaky, betraying her calm demeanor. "Be there in a minute," Ron called back, his gaze fixed on the computer screen, his fingers poised to type out another message to Lisa. As he sent off his message, he felt a momentary pang of guilt, a lingering shadow in the back of his mind. He quickly brushed it off. It was just harmless fun, he told himself. There was no harm in a little online chatting. Besides, what Troy or Brenda didn't know wouldn't hurt them. Brenda's heart pounded as she laid out dinner on the dining table. She had wrestled with her thoughts all day, fluctuating between disbelief, anger, and pain. She decided it was best to confront Ron directly. This was not a matter to be swept under the rug. She took a deep breath as she heard Ron's heavy footsteps approaching. Ron walked into the dining room, his mind still filled with thoughts of Lisa. He'd sent her a message, but she hadn't replied yet. Perhaps she was busy, he reasoned, or maybe she was playing hard to get. He noticed Brenda standing rigidly by the dining table. He felt a pang of unease. "Brenda, what's wrong?" he asked, his eyebrows furrowing with concern. Brenda turned to face him, her hands tightly clenched into fists. Her eyes were glassy, mirroring the pain she was struggling to keep at bay. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to do. "Who is Lisa, Ron?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ron froze. a chill running down his spine. For a moment, he thought he'd misheard. His heart pounded in his chest, the silence in the room amplifying the sound. "Brenda," he began, his voice sounding shaky even to his own ears. I saw the messages, Ron. I know everything." Her voice was firm now, her eyes filled with a challenging spark. This was not a question, but a statement. A proclamation of a battle that had just begun. The silence that followed was deafening. Brenda looked at Ron, her gaze steely and resolute. She was no longer the woman who smiled politely at his lame jokes, or the woman who had believed his every word. This was a woman scorned. "Did you think I wouldn't find out, Ron?" she began, her voice firm and steady. "Did you think your secret life would stay hidden forever?" Ron swallowed hard, his throat suddenly feeling dry. He tried to form words, to explain, to apologize, but words failed him. Brenda continued, "We made promises, Ron. We promised to be faithful, to be honest. We promised to trust each other. But you betrayed that trust." She picked up his phone, the damning messages glaring from the screen. "This isn't you. This isn't the man I married," she said, her voice wavering for the first time. "I thought we had something special, something real. But all this," she gestured with the phone, "this is a lie. It's all a lie." Tears welled in her eyes, but she fought them back. She wouldn't cry. Not now, not in front of him. "I've spent my life being honest, being faithful to you. And this is what I get in return." Her voice was a mix of anger and sorrow. A husband who can't be trusted, who would rather flirt with a young woman online than be truthful to his wife. She looked at Ron, her disappointment clear in her eyes. "You broke my heart, Ron. But more than that, you broke my trust. And that's something I don't know if I can ever forgive." Ron looked at Brenda, her face hardened with accusation and hurt. He felt his heart tighten. He wanted to reach out to her, to comfort her, but he knew it wasn't his place. Not now. "Brenda," he started, his voice a mere whisper. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It was just a game." Brenda looked at him incredulously. "A game, Ron? You think lying and cheating is a game?" No. I didn't cheat, Brenda," Ron stuttered, his hands shaking slightly. "I was just talking. Chatting. It was nothing serious." Brenda snorted. "Nothing serious. Ron, you've been leading a double life. You've been lying to me, to yourself. And for what? For some attention from a young woman online." Ron rubbed his forehead, a gesture of frustration. "I didn't lie, Brenda. I just didn't tell you. And it's not about attention. It's about feeling alive." Brenda filled in the word for him, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Ron's silence was answer enough. "And where does that leave me, Ron?" Brenda's voice was softer now, more hurt than angry. "Where does that leave us?" Ron had no answer. He looked at Brenda, at the woman he had hurt with his careless actions, and felt a pang of guilt. But the damage was done. The truth was out, and now they both had to deal with the consequences. There was a heavy silence between them, only the low ticking of the kitchen clock filling the void. Ron's fingers absently traced the outline of the coffee mug in front of him. Brenda sat opposite him, her arms folded, her eyes distant. "Truth is complex, isn't it?" Ron finally broke the silence. His voice was contemplative, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "I mean, I'm not the man in that picture. Not anymore. But I was." Brenda looked at him, her gaze unreadable. "And does that make it right, Ron? Does that justify you pretending to be someone you're not? Not just to her, but to me too?" "I didn't mean to pretend, Brenda. Ron confessed. It was just easier to slip into the old shoes, to be the man I used to be, the man who was, brave who was, desired. But that's not who you are now, Ron. Brenda sighed deeply. And the more you pretend, the more you lie, not only to us, but to yourself. Ron swallowed hard, a lump forming in his throat. I didn't think of it as lying, Brenda. And that's the problem, Ron. Brenda's voice was steady, unyielding. You see, lies aren't always about falsehoods. Sometimes they're about hiding the truth from others, from ourselves. And when we start believing in those lies, we lose ourselves in them. Ron leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling with Brenda's words. He looked at her, the hurt in her eyes, the disappointment. He realized then he had not only deceived her, he had deceived himself. You're right, Brenda, he admitted, the reality of his actions dawning on him. I lost myself in the lies, in the illusion. And in the process, I lost you. Brenda gave him a sad smile, a silent acknowledgement of his confession. They sat there, their relationship hanging in the balance. Two people entangled in a web of truth and lies. Despite the cathartic exchange, an uncomfortable stillness lingered in the air, a testament to the damage that had been done. Ron felt a pang of guilt, staring at the hollow expression on Brenda's face. He realized that his words, no matter how sincere, could not undo the hurt he had caused. I'm sorry, Brenda, Ron murmured, gripping the edges of the kitchen table, his knuckles turning white. Brenda looked up at him, her eyes reflecting a maelstrom of emotions. Ron, she began, her voice weary and laced with pain. Apologies can mend mistakes, not breaches of trust. Ron nodded, understanding the depth of her words. It wasn't just about an online flirtation. It was about the breaking of vows, the crumbling of trust, the deception, and the lies that had built a wall between them. I don't know where we go from here, Brenda, Ron admitted, feeling a lump in his throat. I just hope we can find a way back. Brenda let out a sigh, leaning back in her chair, her gaze distant. I don't know either, Ron, she responded, her voice barely above a whisper. The kitchen clock continued its steady rhythm, marking the passing of time, the two of them lost in their own thoughts. Their future hung in the balance, each left to navigate the intricacies of trust and honesties, truth and lies. It was clear the argument had widened the gap between them, the fallout from Ron's actions still a chasm they had yet to bridge. As they sat in silence, both wondered if their relationship could weather the storm. The glass factory seemed particularly dreary the next day. Ron arrived at work with the weight of the previous night's argument pressing on his shoulders. His reflection in the glass mirrors of the factory portrayed a man visibly shaken, a stark contrast to his new look. He found Troy at his workstation, focused on the meticulous process of shaping molten glass. Ron looked at Troy, the muscles of his friend's arms rippling as he worked. A pang of jealousy lashed out inside him, but it was quickly overshadowed by his need to unburden his guilt. Troy, Ron began, his voice strained. Troy paused, looked up at Ron, and immediately noticed the pallor of his friend's face. Ron, you look like hell. What's up? Ron hesitated before blurting out, I had a fight with Brenda. Troy put down his tools, concern creasing his face. What about? Ron hesitated before admitting she found out about. Troy's eyebrows shot up. He was silent for a moment, and then he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Man, Ron, I tried to warn you. I know, Ron acknowledged, his voice barely a whisper. I should have listened. He looked up at Troy, his eyes holding a plea for understanding. I don't know what to do, Troy. For a moment, Troy simply looked at Ron. Then, with a sigh, he replied, We'll figure it out, buddy. We always do. There was a sincerity in his voice that Ron had always appreciated, even though at this moment it stung with the reality of his predicament. The glass factory seemed particularly dreary the next day. Ron arrived at work with the weight of the previous night's argument pressing on his shoulders. His reflection in the glass mirrors of the factory portrayed a man visibly shaken, a stark contrast to his new look. He found Troy at his workstation, focused on the meticulous process of shaping molten glass. Ron looked at Troy, the muscles of his friend's arms rippling as he worked. A pang of jealousy lashed out inside him, but it was quickly overshadowed by his need to unburden his guilt. "Troy," Ron began, his voice strained. Troy paused, looked up at Ron, and immediately noticed the pallor of his friend's face. "Ron, you look like hell. What's up?" Ron hesitated before blurting out, "I had a fight with Brenda." Troy put down his tools, concern creasing his face. "What about—" Ron hesitated before admitting she found out about. Troy's eyebrows shot up. He was silent for a moment, and then he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Man, Ron, I tried to warn you." "I know," Ron acknowledged, his voice barely a whisper. "I should have listened." He looked up at Troy, his eyes holding a plea for understanding. "I don't know what to do, Troy." For a moment, Troy simply looked at Ron. Then, with a sigh, he replied, "We'll figure it out, buddy. We always do." There was a sincerity in his voice that Ron had always appreciated, even though at this moment it stung with the reality of his predicament. They stood in silence, a shared discomfort filling the space between them. Troy's gaze shifted uneasily around the factory floor, lost in the swirls of steam rising from the cooling glass. The whirring and clanging of machinery played a hollow symphony to the pounding in his chest. Taking a deep breath, he finally turned back to Ron. "There's something I need to tell you, Ron," Troy started, his voice barely above a whisper. Ron's gaze flickered towards Troy, his brow creasing. Troy swallowed, feeling as though each word was being drawn out from the depths of his gut. I befriended the girl on Facebook too." The silence that followed seemed to stretch out, the only sounds coming from the machinery around them. Ron's face darkened. "You what?" Troy began, then faltered. "You've been talking to her behind my back." Ron's voice was cold, his eyes glinting with a hint of betrayal. His hands curled into fists at his sides. "I haven't been flirting or anything," Troy quickly added. "I just wanted to make sure she was real, that she wasn't going to hurt you." Ron was silent, his expression hard. He turned away from Troy, staring blankly at the industrial landscape of the factory, his mind racing. "I can't believe you do this, Troy," he finally muttered, more to himself than to Troy. "I thought you were my friend." "I am, Ron," Troy replied, desperation seeping into his voice. "That's why I did it." Yet as he watched Ron's retreating back, he couldn't help but feel the heaviness of guilt wrap around him, suffocating the last vestiges of justification he had for his actions. Despite his intentions, he had crossed a line, and now the consequences loomed large between him and his friend. As Troy's confession echoed in his mind, a flush of anger and betrayal washed over Ron. He felt his heart pound in his chest, his thoughts swirling in a torrent of confusion and indignation. "You've been talking to her," he repeated, his voice rising in pitch. He turned to face Troy, his face a mask of bewilderment and anger. "My friend, you're my friend, and you went behind my back." "I'm sorry, Ron," Troy pleaded, his face pale. "I was just trying to look out for you." "By stabbing me in the back." Ron's voice was laced with bitterness, his gaze hard. "I shared something personal with you, Troy, and you used it against me." "No, Ron, it wasn't like that," Troy replied, desperation creeping into his voice. His hand reached out in a futile attempt to calm Ron down, but the older man quickly jerked away. "Don't touch me," Ron growled, his jaw set in a tight line. He took a few steps back, putting a physical distance between them that mirrored the growing chasm in their friendship. "I thought I could trust you, Troy. I thought you were my friend." "I am your friend, Ron," Troy insisted, his voice strangled. "I just—" "Mistake," Ron scoffed, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "Or was this all just some game to you, Troy? Get close to the old man, find out his secrets, then use them for your own gain." "That's not what this was, Ron, I swear." But Ron didn't wait for him to finish. With a final seething glance at Troy, he turned on his heel and strode away, leaving Troy standing alone amidst the clattering noise of the factory, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him like a physical force. The revelation of Troy's actions sent shockwaves through the fabric of their friendship, creating an insurmountable barrier of betrayal and distrust. The following days were suffused with a palpable tension. The usual friendly banter that characterized their shifts at the glass factory turned into an awkward silence. The air between them was thick with unspoken words and simmering resentment, and their coworkers couldn't help but notice the shift in their dynamic. One afternoon, as they were clocking out for the day, Ron found himself walking alongside Troy. The silence was deafening. He glanced at Troy, his mouth set in a thin line. "You think this is fair, Troy?" he asked, his voice low. The question hung in the air between them, charged with accusation. Troy sighed, rubbing his face with his hands. He looked older, tired. "No, Ron," he admitted. "It wasn't fair. I should have been honest with you." "Honesty," Ron scoffed, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "There's a concept. I guess neither of us is too good at that, huh?" Troy didn't have a response to that. His guilt was a physical weight in his stomach, a constant reminder of his betrayal. He had wanted to protect Ron, but he had only succeeded in further damaging their relationship. And then there was the woman, the object of both their affections, a symbol of their shattered friendship. Her unknowing presence loomed over them, a silent specter that kept reminding them of their deceit, their guilt, and their undeniable connection to her. As they parted ways at the end of their shift, the strained silence between them spoke volumes. Their once strong friendship had been fractured, and it was unclear if it would ever mend. As they went their separate ways, the weight of their actions and the unresolved tension lingered in the air, marking the start of a tumultuous period in their lives. As Ron settled into the driver's seat of his old pickup, he took one last glance at Troy, who was disappearing into the gloomy twilight. His heart pounded against his ribcage, fueled by a potent mix of anger, jealousy, and betrayal. He clenched his fists around the steering wheel, the plastic biting into his skin, offering a semblance of a distraction from the whirlwind of emotions brewing inside him. Troy had betrayed him, and what's worse, he had betrayed him over her. The young woman who had breathed life into his monotonous existence, the digital siren who had unknowingly stirred up a storm in his life, was now the crux of his falling out with Troy. He started the truck, the engine's familiar grumble offering a sense of normalcy in the chaos of his emotions. As he pulled out of the factory parking lot, he found himself dwelling on Troy's confession. He replayed the conversation in his head, Troy's words echoing in his mind, amplifying his jealousy and resentment. "I'm her friend on Facebook too, Ron," Troy had said, the words cutting deeper than any physical wound. Back at his house, Ron sat alone in the dimly lit living room, the glow of the television casting long, dancing shadows around him. His mind was a battlefield, torn between guilt over his online deception and anger at Troy's betrayal. He thought of his wife too, her disappointed face, the strain in her voice as she spoke of trust and honesty. It was all spiraling out of control, and Ron was at the center, caught in a web of his own deceit. Picture Ron alone in his thoughts, staring blankly at the TV screen, his mind far from the images flashing before him. His heart was heavy with guilt, his mind ablaze with anger and jealousy. The seeds of conflict were well and truly sown, promising to germinate into a disaster that could shatter lives and friendships. Little did he know, the storm was just beginning to gather. The factory floor echoed with the rhythmic hum of machines, a symphony of productivity that had been the soundtrack to Ron's workday for years. The conveyor belts transported their materials and the workers moved in their well-practiced dance of efficiency. But today, that cadence would be disrupted. A piercing scream suddenly shattered the mechanical chorus, quickly followed by the frantic pressing of emergency stop buttons. Workers rushed towards the source of the commotion, their faces turning ashen with horror. Jake, a hard-working young man with a passion for mechanics, had his upper arm horrifically caught in one of the more substantial machines. The machinery, designed to shape and mold hard plastic, had no trouble causing significant harm to human flesh. Ron, being nearest to Jake when the incident happened, was the first to reach him. He tried to calm Jake down, whose face was contorted in pain and terror. "Hold on, Jake. Help's on the way," Ron yelled over the panicked shouts and calls for the medical team. Roman, the safety guy, sprinted to the scene, his safety kit in hand. Without missing a beat, he started directing workers. "Turn off the main power. We need to release the pressure from the machine." Ron could see Jake's lips moving, whispering words he couldn't quite make out amidst the chaos. Leaning in closer, he heard Jake murmur, It just pulled me in, Ron." A group of workers managed to manually reverse a segment of the machinery, relieving some pressure and allowing Jake's arm to be freed. The injury was severe. The upper part of his arm was mangled, bloodied, and unmistakably broken in multiple places. The factory's medical team arrived swiftly, stabilizing Jake and preparing him for the ambulance's arrival. Ron stayed by his side, holding his hand, trying to offer a semblance of comfort. Roman, once ensuring that Jake was in capable hands, turned his attention to the machine. His face wore an expression of guilt and frustration. Every accident in the factory was a direct hit to his responsibility as the safety expert. The day's work halted as the workers, shaken by the event, gathered around. The atmosphere was thick with a mix of relief that it hadn't been worse, and sorrow for Jake's pain and the long recovery he surely faced. As the ambulance sirens faded in the distance, taking Jake to the nearest hospital, the factory remained eerily silent. The machine stood still, a stark reminder of the dangers lurking in everyday routines. The incident would forever change the way many viewed their tasks, and for Ron, it was another layer to the intricate web of experiences shaping his life. The factory's break room bore a heavy atmosphere, an amalgamation of heightened stress and the pressing importance of Jake's accident. Every seat was taken, each face showing varying degrees of concern, as they all waited for the imminent safety briefing. Roman, the factory's designated safety officer, adjusted his presentation, his demeanor exuding professionalism. This meeting was imperative, a response to Jake's harrowing accident, a necessity to underscore safety protocols. But for Ron, his mental space was occupied by more than just the incident. His eyes kept darting over to Troy, who, to Ron's dismay, seemed intermittently engrossed in his phone. Every buzz of Troy's device sent Ron's heart racing. Each smirk that played on Troy's lips felt like a stab. Was Troy texting her? The girl Ron once poured his heart out to online? Roman's voice cut through Ron's thoughts. Jake's incident was a grave reminder that complacency can have serious repercussions, Roman remarked, emphasizing the need for collective responsibility. The room was palpable with the collective acknowledgement of his words, everyone understanding the severity of what had transpired. Except it seemed to Ron, Troy. The man continued to steal glances at his phone, quickly typing responses, his face lighting up with subtle glee every now and then. To Ron, it felt like a betrayal. He had confided in Troy about his online conversations with her, about the shared moments, the laughter, the secrets. Now, watching Troy, Ron's trust wavered. Was his friend really pursuing her behind his back? The room bristled with tension as Roman and Felicia clashed, their argument echoing off the drab, gray walls of the conference room. Risking our lives to save a buck? Is that the company policy, Felicia? Roman shot back, his voice laced with anger and disbelief. Felicia retorted, her voice stern and controlled. Roman, we're trying to keep this factory running. We have responsibilities to our stakeholders. We're not intentionally risking anyone's lives. The accident was unfortunate and regrettable. Troy shook his head, scoffing under his breath. He'd heard these arguments too many times, the management justifying compromises in safety for the sake of finances. Beside him, Ron seethed in silence, his attention divided between the heated argument and his personal issues with Troy. Every glance at Troy, every word he said, stoked the fire of resentment in him. The more distracted Troy seemed with the argument, the more Ron's jealousy and anger grew. You're right, Felicia. It's always about the money, isn't it? How about we start putting lives before profits? Troy's voice echoed around the room, matching Roman's in intensity. The words struck a nerve. The room fell silent. The argument highlighted the stark divide between the workers' safety concerns and the management's financial priorities. Ron, grappling with his personal issues, couldn't help but see the parallel between the increasing tensions at work and his friendship with Troy. As the meeting drew to a close, the factory was left buzzing with heightened tensions. Roman's face was flushed from the argument, his words of safety concern still hanging heavy in the room. Felicia, for her part, wore a tight, strained smile, the cost-effective proposals she presented soured by Roman accusations. Workers shuffled out, their minds filled with a mix of fear, uncertainty, and anger over the revealed conflict between safety and management. And amongst them, Ron and Troy. Their personal tensions simmered beneath the surface, a mirror to the discord in the factory. Ron stole one more glance at Troy. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, a storm of emotions broiling inside him. "This ain't over," he muttered under his breath, each word a whispered promise of impending confrontations. Troy, engrossed in his phone, missed the bitter vow. He pocketed his phone and left the room, oblivious to the impending storm. But just like the workplace safety issue, their personal conflict was far from a resolution. It was nearing sundown when the men of the glass factory made their way to Steve's Soul Food. The restaurant was a local fixture, beloved for its rustic charm, warm hospitality, and most importantly, its mouth-watering, home-style dishes. The warm glow from the hanging lights spilled onto the streets, beckoning the weary workers inside with the promise of comfort food and camaraderie after a long day. As Ron and Troy stepped in, the heady aroma of fried chicken, smoky ribs, and baked mac and cheese enveloped them. The low hum of laughter and chatter from the regular patrons filled the air, a familiar soundtrack to their evenings. Pictures of Steve, the amiable owner, with various customers, adorned the walls, reinforcing the feeling of community that was the restaurant's signature. The men occupied their usual corner table, surrounded by worn wooden benches. Ron glanced at Troy, his brow furrowed. The normally welcoming ambiance of Steve's Soul Food did nothing to ease the storm brewing inside him. Today, their usual post-work ritual was primed for confrontation. The stage was set for a different kind of soul food to be served. As they settled into their seats, Roman, the burly safety officer, joined them. His face was a mask of worry, the events of the day visibly weighing on him. Ron glanced at him, noting the way his hands gripped his drink. "Management isn't going to take this accident lightly," Roman began, his voice filled with a grave seriousness that mirrored the situation they were facing. "I know, Roman," Troy responded, a troubled look on his face. He had seen the extent of the injury and knew the repercussions could be severe. It was a terrible incident. Ron chimed in, his voice tinged with anger, and Felicia just sits in her plush office, oblivious to what we risk every day on the factory floor. It's easy to dismiss safety when you're not the one surrounded by molten glass. Roman sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. I fear for my job, guys. My argument with Felicia, it was heated. She's not one to forget such confrontations. Don't you worry, Roman, Troy reassured him. We're in this together. You stood up for what's right. That's more important than Felicia's ego. Ron nodded, adding, We have your back, Roman. But we need to be prepared for what's to come. The gravity of his own words made him glance at Troy, the undertone of their personal conflict simmering beneath the surface. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the tension was palpable. The warm, aromatic sense of Steve's soul food restaurant filled the air, a stark contrast to the palpable tension that had settled between Ron and Troy. As soulful tunes softly played in the background and other patrons chatted amiably, the corner booth became a battleground. Ron, his fingers digging into the checkered tablecloth, locked his gaze onto Troy. Who were you texting earlier? He growled, every word dripping with accusation. Troy, taken aback by the sudden confrontation but unwilling to back down, met Ron's gaze defiantly. Why is it any of your concern? Ron's eyes blazed. Is it her? The girl from online? Troy's lips thinned, his restraint evident. You don't own her, Ron. Ron's fist clenched, his anger boiling over. You knew how much she meant to me, and you just swoop in behind my back. Troy's voice became dangerously low. Maybe if you were honest with her, she wouldn't have felt the need to move on. The two men stared at each other, the weight of their history pressing down on them. The soulful ambiance of the restaurant became a mere backdrop to their intense standoff. As murmurs and glances from neighboring tables began to focus on them, the two realized the scene they were causing. Breathing heavily, Ron finally spoke, his voice cracking with emotion. You are my friend. Troy. How could you? Troy looked away, struggling with his own feelings of guilt and anger. The evening had taken a turn neither had anticipated, changing the landscape of their friendship forever. As the silence stretched, Troy took a deep breath, steeling himself for the argument he knew was coming. He opened his mouth, choosing his words carefully. Ron, I didn't mean, he began, but was cut off by an indignant Ron. Didn't mean? Didn't mean. Ron's voice rose, his anger spilling out into the restaurant. You didn't mean to betray our friendship, or you didn't mean to get caught. I didn't think. Troy tried again. That's right. You didn't think. Ron seethed, his voice thundering through the previously lively restaurant. The bustle of the place seemed to quiet, the other patrons eyeing the escalating argument with veiled curiosity and discomfort. Troy swallowed hard, pushing down his guilt. Ron, I didn't befriend her to spite you. I did it too. He hesitated, unable to explain his motivations in a way that wouldn't inflame the situation further. But Ron wasn't in the mood to listen, his sense of betrayal blinding him to anything else. You've crossed a line, Troy, he warned, pointing a finger at him. This isn't over. The argument came to a heated end, leaving a palpable tension hanging in the air. The restaurant, once filled with the friendly chatter of the afterwork crowd, fell into an uneasy quiet, the patrons giving the table a wide berth. The confrontation had shifted the atmosphere entirely, leaving a sour taste in the mouth of their camaraderie. The argument concluded, but the tension remained, a grim specter hovering over their table. Troy looked down at his uneaten food, appetite lost in the midst of their heated exchange, while Ron, red-faced and fuming, was visibly shaking with barely suppressed rage. Around them, the restaurant had quietened, the other patrons casting surreptitious glances their way. their curiosity tinged with unease. Ron stood abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. "I can't do this right now," he declared, voice thick with unshed anger and betrayal. He threw down some bills for his meal, not bothering to count them. Troy watched as Ron stalked out of the restaurant, the door slamming shut behind him. The remaining silence was deafening. Troy could feel eyes on him, the weight of their scrutiny heavy. He sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose, the reality of their situation sinking in. Things had taken a turn, their friendship on the verge of breaking, and he wasn't sure how or even if they could mend it. Troy sat alone, his food long forgotten, stewing in the aftermath of Ron's confrontation. As he looked around the restaurant, still feeling the weight of judgmental stares, he felt a surge of indignation. This wasn't his fault. He hadn't started this, Ron had. And yet, here he was, bearing the brunt of the man's jealousy. Finally, he rose from the table, throwing down some money for his untouched meal, and walked out into the cooling evening. Ron was still outside, pacing angrily and cursing under his breath. Troy felt a jolt of sympathy, but quickly squashed it. This was a confrontation of Ron's making. He had no obligation to back down. He walked straight up to Ron. "I didn't start this," he began, voice steady despite the emotional turmoil churning within him. "You did, and you've got no right to throw accusations at me when you're the one messing around behind your wife's back." Ron reeled as if slapped, his eyes widening in surprise and then narrowing in anger. "You're just a kid, Troy," he spat. But Troy wasn't deterred. "And you're just an old man, Ron," Troy retorted, "trying to relive your glory days by chasing after some woman online. You think dyeing your hair and getting a new haircut makes you younger. It just makes you look desperate." Ron's face turned a deep shade of red, but Troy pressed on. "You're a joke at the factory, Ron. Everyone laughs behind your back. You're a has. Been desperately trying to hold on to a youth that has long since slipped away." As his words hit home, Ron's features tightened, his gaze turning icy. He'd struck a nerve. Troy could see that, but he felt no remorse. It was about time someone put Ron in his place, showed him the harsh reality of his actions. And if he was the one to do it, then so be it. Ron stood there, teeth clenched and face flushed, as Troy's words echoed in his head. They were hurtful, humiliating, and worst of all, true. He was just an old man chasing his lost youth. The reality of this revelation left him feeling naked and exposed, a raw wound for everyone to see. "What did you just say?" Ron's voice came out as a growl, low and dangerous. "You think you can disrespect me like that? Me, who has worked his entire life, put sweat and blood into everything, while you've barely seen anything beyond your mom's basement." Troy's defiant gaze didn't waver. He was unmoved by Ron's anger, almost expectant. This only served to fuel the fury bubbling within Ron. A fight. A physical fight. It was an absurd idea, but it was the only thing that made sense in his fog of anger and wounded pride. "Fight me," Ron challenged, jabbing a finger into Troy's chest. "If you're man enough to confront me with your big words, be man enough to back them up." Troy took a step back, eyebrows raised in surprise and a trace of apprehension in his eyes. The reality of Ron's challenge seemed to take a moment to sink in. "What?" Troy stuttered. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," Ron spat out, the streetlight catching the fiery determination in his eyes. "Let's see who's the joke." The stage was set. The challenge was laid out. All that was left was for Troy to accept. And as Ron stared down at him, waiting for a response, he couldn't help but feel a perverse thrill in the anticipation. His life might be spiraling out of control, but this was something he could grasp, something he could fight against. And fight. He would. Troy blinked, taken aback by the fiery challenge thrown at his feet. "Ron, The old man he had worked with for years was challenging him to a fight. It was surreal, absurd even. But the serious look in Ron's eyes left no room for doubt. He was not joking. "Ron," Troy began, struggling to maintain a level-headed demeanor, "you've got to be kidding me." "Does it look like I'm kidding?" Ron responded. His gruff voice echoed in the silent night. For a moment, Troy could see the desperation in Ron's eyes. This wasn't about him. It was about Ron trying to hold on to something slipping away. It was a raw, ugly spectacle of a man at the end of his rope. Troy felt a sudden pang of empathy for the older man. But that didn't mean he would indulge this madness. "Look, Ron," Troy started again, steadying his voice. "I'm not going to fight you. This isn't high school. We're not kids anymore." He paused, looking Ron straight in the eyes. "You're old enough to be my dad, for God's sake. I'm not going to punch you over some online drama." Ron's face twitched at the word old, but he said nothing. The tense silence stretched between them, only broken by the distant hum of the city. "Ron, we need to handle this like adults," Troy added, "not by throwing punches." But as Troy looked at the hardened expression on Ron's face, he wasn't sure his words were reaching him. The situation was escalating beyond anything he could have anticipated, and he wasn't sure how to put the brakes on it. For the first time in their argument, Troy felt a cold trickle of dread. This was not going to end well. Troy's refusal was a bucket of ice water over Ron's head. The words hung in the air like a damning verdict, cutting deeper than any physical blow. His heart pounded against his ribs, each beat echoing Troy's words. Old. Refuse. Adults. The humiliation, already simmering, started to boil over. Ron felt his face flush, the heat of his rage burning behind his eyes. "Fine," he spat out, the single word laden with resentment. "Just fine." He turned abruptly, walking away without a backwards glance. Troy's refusal had stung him, but the patronizing tone of his words felt even worse. He'd been reduced to a pathetic old man, a joke. The laughter and shared glances he imagined were directed at him at the factory seemed to prove it true. His hands clenched at the thought, the edge of his key digging into his palm. As he climbed into his truck, he fought back against the unwelcome sting of tears. This wasn't about a mere Facebook woman anymore. This was about his dignity, his self-respect. He wouldn't let Troy walk away, scot-free, not after everything. "I'll show him," he muttered to himself, the truck roaring to life beneath him. The dark silhouette of the restaurant loomed in his rearview mirror, a constant reminder of the struggle that had become his life. Ron was not sure what he would do, but he knew that he wouldn't let this go. A plan began to formulate in the back of his mind, like a creeping shadow. It was a dark and uncharacteristic path, but his resentment fueled him. As he drove off into the chilly night, the illuminated sign of Steve's Soul Food faded into the distance, taking with it the last remnants of his old life. This was a new Ron, one molded by betrayal and hardened by humiliation. He would have his revenge. It was just a matter of time. The tension in Steve's Soul Food didn't dissipate with Ron's departure. It hung thick in the air, filling the space he'd left behind. The room, once filled with lively chatter, had fallen silent at the sudden outburst. Conversations had stilled, utensils had stopped clinking, and even the sizzle from the kitchen seemed to have quieted down. All eyes were on Troy, who stood rooted to his spot, his face pale under the harsh, fluorescent light. Troy stared at the door, his mind racing to catch up with the whirlwind of events. He could still feel the echoes of Ron's rage and the sting of his challenge. He couldn't shake off the way Ron's eyes had hardened, the intensity in them speaking volumes. And he couldn't ignore the chilling promise of revenge hanging in the air. There was an uncomfortable shift around him as people started murmuring, returning slowly to their meals. The normal sounds of the restaurant gradually resumed, but the evening's cheer had dimmed. replaced by a muted apprehension. Roman broke the silence. "You okay, Troy?" Troy turned to him, his face reflecting a mix of emotions: shock, guilt, and a hint of regret. "Yeah, Roman. I didn't see that coming." Roman patted Troy on the back, a sympathetic frown on his face. "Ron's hot-headed. He'll cool down." Troy nodded, although he wasn't as sure as Roman. This wasn't just about Ron's anger. This was about a deep-seated betrayal that he had unintentionally inflicted upon his friend. He knew Ron. When Ron got an idea into his head, it was like a dog with a bone. He wouldn't let it go. As Troy gazed at the empty chair where Ron had sat just minutes before, a sense of unease washed over him. The echoes of their argument were still ringing in his ears, the ominous undercurrent of Ron's last words resonating ominously. Tonight had shifted something in their friendship, and Troy couldn't help but feel a chill at the thought of what might come next. In the dim lighting of the bar, surrounded by the comforting aroma of comfort food, Troy was suddenly confronted by the cold reality of his strained relationship with Ron. It was a sobering end to an evening that had begun like any other, but was now foreshadowing events that Troy had never anticipated. Ron's knuckles were white on the steering wheel as he navigated the dark streets towards his home. His heartbeat still echoed in his ears, the adrenaline from the confrontation with Troy making his senses unusually sharp. Every honk, every glare of oncoming headlights, every flicker of a street lamp seemed heightened. His mind was a battleground of emotions, dominated by the stinging humiliation that Troy had inflicted upon him. The words Troy had hurled were as clear as if he had just spoken them. Comments about his age, appearance, and past actions. Accusations that hadn't just pricked his pride, but ripped it apart. His thoughts drifted to the woman on Facebook, the young, enchanting woman who had become the epicenter of this discord. A bitter laugh escaped his lips as he thought about how a virtual relationship had stirred such palpable emotions. But she wasn't just any woman. She was his solace, his escape from reality, a reality that seemed increasingly gloomy. Troy's betrayal, his words, his refusal to fight, they all churned within Ron, boiling his anger and frustration. His foot pressed down harder on the accelerator, the engine's roar reflecting his internal turmoil. He had wanted a fight, a physical confrontation where he could vent his rage and assert himself. Troy's refusal felt like another slap to his already wounded pride. As he approached his house, the sight of the darkened windows sparked a sense of dread within him. His marital discord seemed to await him behind those closed doors, casting a dark shadow over his life. His feelings for his wife had been overshadowed by his online escapade, and now it seemed to be falling apart like a house of cards. He parked the car in the driveway, his hands lingering on the steering wheel. He stared at the house, his mind filled with chaotic thoughts. His confrontation with Troy, his distraught wife, the Facebook woman, his own bruised ego. But amongst the chaos, a dark resolve was taking shape. Revenge was not a question of if but when and how. As he stepped out of the car, the cool night air seemed to harden his resolve. The drive home, usually a time of reflection and relaxation, had tonight become a crucible for his seething emotions. He walked towards his house, the darkness swallowing him, echoing the looming darkness in his mind. Quietly, Ron entered his home, the echoes of Troy's insults still ringing in his ears. He made his way up the creaky staircase to the bedroom he shared with his wife. The room was dark, save for the moonlight peeking through the slightly parted curtains. He cast a glance at the bed, seeing the silhouette of his sleeping wife. The sight of her stirred a cocktail of emotions in him. Guilt, regret, resentment, all overlaid with a sense of foreboding. He moved to the closet, a grim determination guiding his actions. Hidden behind rows of shirts and a stack of dusty old boxes was a locked case, its existence known to him alone. It was a relic of his past, a remnant of his days spent in the army. his Mortein rifle. He retrieved the case, his fingers tracing the cold metal locks, a surge of nostalgia washing over him. Sitting on the edge of the bed, he unlocked the case. The rifle lay inside, polished and preserved, a deadly artifact of his past. He picked it up, the familiar weight stirring memories of his youth and former strength. A dangerous glint appeared in his eyes as he loaded the rifle, the metallic click echoing in the silence. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked at the loaded rifle. He was not a man prone to violence, but tonight was different. Tonight was different. Tonight, the embers of anger and betrayal had fanned into a dangerous flame, one that seemed to find solace in the ominous presence of the weapon. With the loaded rifle in hand, he moved towards his car parked outside, the chill of the night air seeming to mirror the icy resolve that had formed within him. He placed the rifle carefully in the passenger seat, a dark omen of his perilous intentions. The sight of his home in the rearview mirror seemed almost surreal as he sat in his car. The loaded rifle, the discord, the impending revenge. It all felt like he was caught in a storm of his own making. But the storm was here, and Ron seemed ready to navigate it. Consequences be damned. As he pulled out of his driveway, his face hardened, reflecting the dangerous path he was embarking upon. Ron's grip tightened around the steering wheel as he steered his car back toward Steve's Soul Food. The streets were quieter now, the echoes of laughter and the hustle of the evening giving way to the stillness of the night. But the quiet only amplified the noise in Ron's head, a cacophony of past conversations, harsh words and hurt feelings, all culminating into a dangerous resolve. The lights of the restaurant came into view, glowing like a beacon in the dark, drawing him in. His heart pounded in rhythm with the throbbing beat of the song on the radio, a dark melody that seemed to mirror his current state of mind. A surge of anger washed over him as he parked his car across the street. His eyes were fixed on the entrance of Steve's Soul Food, anticipation and rage pulsating through his veins. He could still see the patrons inside, some of them, his colleagues, oblivious to the storm brewing outside. His hand instinctively reached for the trunk, the cold touch of the rifle bringing a grim smile on his face. He could imagine Troy's surprise, his shock, his fear, and that thought alone seemed to ignite a wicked sense of satisfaction within him. He sat there, in his car, staring at the restaurant, the loaded rifle on the seat beside him. Each passing minute, each ticking second was like a string being pulled tighter, the tension building, threatening to snap. His gaze hardened, a testament to the darkness that had enveloped him, an ominous sign of what was to come. The stillness of the night was suddenly broken by the sound of his phone ringing. Ron looked at the screen, seeing his wife's name flashing. He silenced the call, his mind set, his resolve unshaken. And then he stepped out of the car, the lights of Steve's Soul Food reflecting in his eyes, showcasing not only the determination, but also the darkness that had taken root in him. The night was about to witness a confrontation, one that carried the weight of betrayal, resentment, and now a loaded rifle. With the rifle weighing heavy in his hands, Ron moved with a determined stride towards the restaurant. His heartbeat echoed in his ears like the ominous drumming of war. His eyes, hard as flint, were locked onto the figure standing a few paces from the restaurant, immersed in a call. It was Troy. His approach was quiet, almost predatory, and it wasn't until he was a few feet away that Troy finally noticed him. The words froze on Troy's lips as his eyes landed on Ron, and more importantly, on the rifle in his hands. The color drained from his face, his phone slipping from his grip and clattering onto the pavement. "Ron, what the hell?" Troy stammered, his eyes wide with shock and fear. He slowly raised his hands, a universal sign of surrender, his mind racing to make sense of the terrifying scene unfolding before him. The dimly lit street painted a surreal picture, an eerie silence punctuated by the distant hum of the city. Under the glow of the restaurant's neon sign, The two friends stood facing each other, their past camaraderie now replaced by fear and anger. "Ron, put the gun down," Troy urged, his voice trembling. Ron's only response was a cold, hollow laugh. His grip tightened around the rifle, the metal cool and unwavering, just like his resolve. His gaze bore into Troy, reflecting an intensity of emotions that went beyond mere words. For a moment, all that existed was the two of them, the tension tangible in the air, their lives precariously hanging in the balance. Ron's inner turmoil had taken a tangible form, a deadly weapon pointed at his friend, an ominous symbol of the ruin that their friendship had become. The confrontation had taken a chilling turn, one that held the promise of irrevocable consequences. The echo of a gunshot ripped through the night, the sound loud and jarring. The world slowed down for Troy as he registered the sharp pain piercing through him. His knees buckled, and he crumbled to the ground, the asphalt scraping his skin as he fell. Ron stood over him, his face an unreadable mask, the rifle still smoking in his hands. A second shot rang out, and then a third. Troy's body jerked with each impact, his eyes filled with disbelief and shock. The piercing sounds cut through the quiet night, and it felt like the world had taken a pause, holding its breath as Troy's lifeblood seeped out onto the pavement. A collective gasp arose from the few bystanders who had come out of the restaurant, drawn by the initial gunshot. Their faces were pale in the dim light, horror etched in their wide eyes as they watched the brutal scene unfold. "No!" a woman screamed, her voice high and shrill, shattering the eerie silence that had fallen. Others were rooted to their spots, frozen in their shock and fear. Some had their hands over their mouths, their eyes wide and filled with disbelief. A man turned away, unable to watch, his body convulsing with silent sobs. Another round of shots echoed, the harsh sound ricocheting off the walls. Ron's face was hard, his eyes void of any emotion. The rifle, still directed at Troy, seemed to be an extension of his rage, his need for revenge. When the last echo of the gunshots faded, replaced by the horrified whispers and panicked cries of the onlookers, Ron lowered his weapon. He stood over Troy's lifeless form, his expression one of grim satisfaction. The silent street was now a scene of horror, the echoes of their shattered friendship resonating in the air around them. It was a chilling end to a heated confrontation, the night forever scarred by the sound of gunfire and a friendship stained with blood. Picture this. The shopping center was bustling with activity as the old woman sat in her car, waiting patiently. She was listening to music on her phone, tapping her fingers on the steering wheel in time with the beat. Suddenly, the young woman from Facebook emerged from the shopping center, her arms laden with bags. She was walking towards the car when she heard a noise behind her. She stopped and turned, her eyes scanning the parking lot. But there was nothing there. Just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the distant hum of traffic. The young woman shrugged and continued on her way, unaware of the danger that lurked in the shadows. The old woman in the car watched in horror as Ron approached the young woman, who was her daughter. She tried to warn her, but it was too late. There was a loud bang, and the young woman crumpled to the ground. The old woman went into shock as she watched her daughter lying there, motionless. She couldn't believe what had just happened. Her worst fears had been realized, and she was overwhelmed with grief and despair. Ron stood there, the gun still smoking in his hand. He had never meant for things to turn out this way, but he couldn't take back what he had done. He was filled with regret and remorse as he realized the full extent of the damage he had caused. As the old woman sat there, numb with shock, she couldn't help but wonder what had led Ron down this dark path. How had it come to this? And what was she going to do now that her daughter was gone? The bustling shopping center had morphed into a nightmarish crime scene, a chaotic tableau of shocked onlookers, frenzied first responders, and hushed whispers of horrified bystanders. Twisted red and blue lights bounced off the concrete walls of the shopping center, painting the serene evening into a chilling spectacle of eerie shadow play. The heart of this chaos was a still form lying motionless on the cold asphalt of the parking lot. A young woman, Erin. Detective Oskol, a man with years of experience etched into his rugged face, arrived at the scene with his junior partner, Detective Essen. Oskol's eyes, hardened by witnessing countless atrocities, scanned the area, drinking in every detail. He was a human lie detector, a seasoned player of the deadly chess game of crime and punishment. Beside him, Detective Essen, a younger but determined force in the field, kept pace, his eyes holding a different kind of intensity, a flame of justice that refused to be extinguished. He had a reputation for unwrapping layers of complex cases, penetrating the lies and half-truths to expose the core of the truth. "All right, Esson." Oskol's gravelly voice broke through the cacophony of the crime scene. "We've got our work cut out for us." "Yes, sir," Esson replied, pulling out a notepad and pen. Together they wove through the pulsing crowd, reaching the crime scene tape. The sight of the lifeless form of Erin, her arms laden with shopping bags, made Oskol's jaw tighten. Essen, pen poised over his notepad, glanced at his senior. The horror of the sight was evident in his eyes, but he steeled himself, ready to undertake the grim task at hand. The two detectives circled the area, taking note of the shell casings, the trajectory of the fallen bags, and the unfortunate position of Erin's body. The grim tableau painted a picture of a horrifying incident that had shattered the ordinary into the extraordinary. As they worked, a uniformed officer approached, carrying a bagged and tagged M14 assault rifle. "Detective, we found this near the scene. The murder weapon." Esson, kneeling near Erin's lifeless form, looked up. "Any eyed on the second male victim?" "His name's Ronald," the officer replied. "No prior convictions." Oskol took the bagged rifle from the officer, scrutinizing it closely. "All right, get the bodies to the morgue and the rifle to the lab. Let's not leave anything to chance." As the detectives immersed themselves in the grim intricacies of the case, the daunting magnitude of the double murder, suicide, began to sink in. But they were undeterred. The tragic events of the evening were a grim puzzle, a mystery that was begging to be solved. And it was their duty to ensure that the pieces came together, no matter how unsettling the final picture might be. In a small, quiet house that stood stark against the backdrop of the bustling city, Detective Essen sat on a squeaky armchair across from Sophia, the grieving mother of the deceased victim, Erin. The house was filled with a tangible weight of grief, a melancholic haze that hung in the air and turned the ticking clock on the wall into a dolorous metronome. Sophia, an old woman with a pale face that seemed even more colorless against the stark white of her hair, was a picture of profound sorrow. The twinkling eyes that once held joy and vitality were now dull, reflecting a profound pain that only a mother who had lost her child could comprehend. "Miss Sophia," Essen began, his voice carrying an empathetic weight, "I am sincerely sorry for your loss. We're doing everything we can to understand what led to this tragedy." Sophia nodded, her fingers nervously twisting the fabric of her faded dress. She didn't respond, but her silence spoke volumes of the turmoil she was experiencing. The detective decided to tread lightly, aware of the delicate nature of the conversation. "Sophia," he continued, "do you know anything about Ron? The man who—" Her eyes glazed over as she recollected. Her lips quivered as she started speaking. Erin and Ron. They were friends, or at least that's what Erin told me. But Ron, he was a bit off. Essen scribbled into his notepad, feeling the shroud of mystery around Ron slowly beginning to lift. Was there anything unusual about Erin's behavior recently? Did she seem afraid or worried? Sophia shook her head, a single tear trailing down her face. "No, nothing that I noticed. She was her usual self, shopping, working, spending time on her phone, chatting with her friends. I just can't comprehend why Ron would do such a thing. Ehsan paused, gently allowing Sophia the silence she needed. The room echoed with the ticking of the clock and the muffled cries of the bereaved mother. He knew the path to truth was winding and, at times, painful, but it was a path he was determined to tread. Finally, he stood, folding his notepad back into his pocket. "Thank you, Sophia," he said softly. "You've been very helpful." As he stepped out into the fading evening, Ehsan looked back at the grieving woman, a stark silhouette framed in the soft glow of the living room lights. He knew the mystery surrounding Aaron's tragic demise was far from being solved, and the grief-stricken face of Sophia served as a poignant reminder that he needed to unravel this tangled web of betrayal and despair, for the sake of justice and closure. A few days had passed since Detective Ehsan's first visit to Sophia's house. He returned, hoping to gain further insight into Aaron's relationship with Ron. What he uncovered, however, was a revelation far beyond his expectations. "Sophia," he started, a serious tone tinging his usually gentle voice. "There's something that doesn't add up about Aaron's relationship with Ron." Sophia averted her gaze, her fingers ringing together in her lap. The house was silent, save for the dull hum of the city filtering through the windows. Ehsan took a breath, steeling himself for what he had to do next. "Ron's wife told me he'd been spending a lot of time talking to Elisa. On Facebook," he continued, watching her closely, but there was something odd about the messages. Lisa's picture was Aaron. Suddenly, all color drained from Sophia's face. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. Struggling to find the words, she finally met his gaze, a complex mix of fear, guilt, and regret mirrored in her eyes. "Sophia," Ehsan pressed, "were you pretending to be Aaron online?" Tears welled up in Sophia's eyes. Her head bowed low as she nodded in admission. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It started as a game. Aaron was so popular, so loved. I was lonely and, I guess, I wanted to feel that too." Ehsan felt a rush of disbelief, anger, and pity. He took a moment to digest the confession, the gravity of Sophia's deception casting a dark shadow over the case. "Sophia," he finally said, his voice heavy with sorrow and disappointment, "you impersonated your own daughter, leading to a chain of events that resulted in her death. I have no choice but to place you under arrest." Sophia nodded, her face a mask of grief and resignation. The regret in her eyes was potent as she let Ehsan handcuff her. It was a quiet arrest, punctuated by the solemn ticking of the clock and Sophia's quiet sobs echoing through the otherwise silent house. As Ehsan led her out of the house, he felt a heavy pang of empathy. Here was a woman, lost in her loneliness, who had made a terrible choice that led to an even more tragic consequence. The case was far from over, but the unveiling of this deception was a step towards understanding the complexities of Aaron's untimely demise. Sophia's arrest was a somber affair. Detective Ehsan, despite the gravity of her deception, handled her with a kind of weary empathy, understanding that she was a woman wrapped in her own labyrinth of guilt and regret. Yet, the law demanded consequences for actions, regardless of the underlying intentions. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law," Ehsan recited, a phrase he had said hundreds of times, but never with such a weighty pit in his stomach. Sophia only nodded, her gaze fixed on some unseen point in the distance. The police station was cold and unwelcoming, filled with a cacophony of noise. Phones ringing, typewriters clacking, officers discussing cases in hushed tones. But Sophia was numb to it all. Sitting in the holding cell, her mind filled with a deafening silence as she contemplated the whirlwind of events. Days later, she was released on bond. The sun had already set, casting long shadows on the barren streets as she stepped outside. Free, but not free. Her lawyer, a stern woman named Alice, advised her to prepare for a tumultuous journey ahead. The days following her release were shrouded in a fog of guilt and despair. Sophia found herself in a perpetual state of wakefulness, haunted by her daughter's image, the sound of gunshots, and the bitter taste of betrayal. "Aaron, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." One sleepless night melted into the next. Each passing moment, a grim reminder of the tragic turn her life had taken. The four walls of her house seemed to close in on her, the silence speaking volumes about her profound loneliness, the guilt, the remorse, the longing for her daughter. It was a burden that weighed heavy on her, a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. Caught in this cycle of self-reproach, Sophia decided to seek help. Her actions had set off a chain of catastrophic events, and she hoped, desperately, that there was some way she could atone, some way she could find solace amidst the wreckage of her life. Dr. William, a middle-aged man with an air of calm around him, was well known in the city for his expertise in dealing with trauma-induced insomnia. His office was a well-lit room adorned with abstract paintings and shelves filled with medical journals. It was here that Sophia found herself one afternoon, waiting anxiously for her first consultation. As Dr. William entered the room, his eyes met Sophia's. Sophia. "Correct?" he asked, taking a seat opposite her. He studied her carefully, noting the visible signs of exhaustion under her eyes and the tense posture of a woman wound tight. "Yes," Sophia answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "What brings you here?" Dr. William asked, his tone gentle, his gaze patient. I can't sleep," Sophia confessed. "Every time I close my eyes, I see him." Dr. William, sensing her discomfort, leaned back, giving her space. "The devil," she whispered, her hands nervously fidgeting with a loose thread on her sweater. Her voice held a tremor, betraying her fear. "He's there, every time I close my eyes, waiting." Dr. William carefully noted Sophia's words. He could tell that the devil was more than a figment of her imagination. It was the manifestation of her guilt, her remorse, her fears, all cloaked under the metaphor of the devil. It was common for trauma victims to envision their guilt and fear as tangible beings. "That sounds challenging," he acknowledged, maintaining his calm demeanor. "We'll work together on this, Sophia. You're not alone." As Sophia poured out her fears, Dr. William listened with a mixture of professional detachment and genuine empathy. Here was a woman bearing the weight of an enormous guilt, plagued by sleepless nights and haunted by the devil of her own creation. In Dr. William's eyes, Sophia's case was an intriguing labyrinth of psychological complexities. His professional curiosity was piqued, and he found himself ready to uncover the depth of Sophia's guilt, while carefully concealing his own intention of using her case as an opportunity to further his research on trauma-induced insomnia. Dr. Williams sat back in his chair, his expression thoughtful as he studied Sophia. A subtle shift in his demeanor signaled a departure from the compassionate psychiatrist to the driven researcher. The case unfolding before him presented an unparalleled opportunity for his ongoing study on trauma-induced insomnia. However, the proposed sleep study involved significant risks that he had yet to reveal. "Sophia," he began, leaning forward, "there might be a solution to your problem. I've been working on a sleep study that could potentially help you." "A study?" Sophia echoed, her brows furrowing slightly. "I believe so," Dr. Williams said, not entirely truthful. He was well aware of the risks involved, the possible side effects that might even exacerbate her condition. But the promise of scientific breakthrough overshadowed his caution. "It's experimental and comes with its own set of risks, but I truly believe it's worth a shot." "Risks?" Sophia asked, a tremor of fear evident in her voice. but her desperation for relief was far stronger than her fear of the unknown. "If it will help me sleep." Dr. William nodded, satisfied with her response. Yet the weight of his decision pressed on him. "I appreciate your courage, Sophia. We will begin as soon as you're ready." Sophia nodded, hope flickering in her eyes. Here was a chance to escape her torment, to finally find some semblance of peace. Despite the ambiguity surrounding the study, she found herself agreeing to it, driven by her desperation. After Sophia had left his office, Dr. William found himself wrestling with his conscience. The lure of scientific advancement had always been strong, but this time it involved a vulnerable woman grappling with immense guilt and fear. It was a dangerous path, one that could potentially lead to breakthrough or catastrophe. Yet as he looked down at his notes, his mind already charting the course for the study, he realized that he was ready to take the risk. After all, in the pursuit of knowledge, weren't all great scientists forced to wrestle with their own devils? As the door to his office closed behind Sophia, Dr. William sat in silence, his gaze fixed on the closed door. His office, once filled with Sophia's palpable despair, now lay quiet, with only the tick-tock of the wall clock punctuating the silence. Sophia's vulnerability had stirred a certain level of discomfort within him, a prickling sense of guilt for what he was about to subject her to. But this was quickly overshadowed by the compelling allure of what this opportunity could mean for his research, a rare chance to delve into the depths of trauma, induced insomnia, to understand its nuances and effects, and possibly to make a groundbreaking discovery. He spun slowly in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window, where the dimming evening light filtered in through the blinds. If only ethical conundrums were as black and white as day and night, he muttered to himself, a wry smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Yet his determination to venture into this gray area remained unscathed. A breakthrough in his research would not just signify personal success. It could potentially change lives, helping those caught in the relentless grip of their traumas find solace. It was a path fraught with risks, but one he was willing to take. Dr. William finally turned back to his desk, his gaze falling on Sophia's file. He opened it, scanning through the notes he had made during their conversation. Each word, each confession of her guilt and fear only made his resolve stronger. His fingers danced on the keyboard as he began to detail the specific steps for the upcoming study. The plan was bold, risk-laden, and pushed the boundaries of ethical conduct. But it was potentially revolutionary. Pausing for a moment, Dr. William looked at the final protocol for the study on his screen. There was still time to back out, to choose a safer route. Yet he knew that if he didn't seize this opportunity, he'd always be left wondering, what if? His fingers hovered over the keyboard before he pressed the Enter key, submitting the final plan. The deed was done, his course set. Now, all he could do was wait and see what this dangerous path would yield. "Let the game begin," Dr. William murmured, his eyes gleaming with a mix of apprehension and anticipation. This was a gamble, one that could either propel him to unprecedented heights or plunge him into the abyss. He just hoped that Sophia would emerge unscathed on the other side. The silence of the evening was shattered by the sudden shrill ringing of Dr. William's phone. He looked at the caller ID, his heart pounding in his chest. It was the medical lab he had partnered with for the sleep study. "Dr. William," the voice on the other end greeted. "Great," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "And the equipment? Is it ready?" "Yes, it is. We'll start the setup tomorrow." "Thank you. Keep me updated." As he ended the call, he couldn't help but feel a rush of adrenaline. The wheels were in motion, and there was no turning back now. Yet, he couldn't shake off the undercurrent of unease. The stakes were high, not just for him, but also for Sophia. Back at her home, Sophia lay on her couch, her mind in turmoil. The images of Aaron, Ron, and the tragic ending played in a loop, tormenting her. A sense of dread gnawed at her as she thought about the sleep study. Would she finally find peace, or would she be thrust deeper into her nightmares? Meanwhile, Detective Essen was poring over Sophia's case file, his brow furrowed in concentration. Despite Sophia's confession and subsequent arrest, there were still many loose ends that needed to be tied up. He knew there was more to the story, more to Sophia, and he was determined to uncover it all. As the clock struck midnight, each character in this tangled web was battling their own demons. They were on the cusp of new discoveries, of drastic changes. But what these changes would bring, they couldn't tell. The future was uncertain, their paths unclear. All they could do was brace themselves for the storm that was about to hit.